I love that you referenced Alan Greenberg, a memo from Bear Stearns way back in the day. But he said he was looking for PSDs. Can you explain what he meant in that memo?
Yes. So at the time, much like today, you had people who were really starting to value, people who were getting these advanced business degrees, and they were MBAs and others. And he said, no, we want PSDs. We want people who are poor, smart, and have a deep desire to become rich, because those people have a drive that you just will not beat.
Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Hey everybody, CJ back with another episode of the Run the Numbers podcast. And this one, boy, do we have an expert for you today. We talked to Dr. Julie Gurner, the author of one of my favorite Substacks. It's called Ultra Successful. And I've been reading her for a while because she's kind of like the real person incarnation of Wendy Rhodes from Billions, who helps with all the self-talk and the mental frameworks for all these billionaire traders in the show. She's Dr. Julie Gurner's worked with top CEOs, CFOs, entrepreneurs to help them with managing basically their ambition, managing their goals, and helping with their self-talk. That's the first thing that we touch on here. I always like to joke that nobody's meaner to CJ than CJ. A lot of you out there probably also have negative self-talk that's damaging. We go through some helpful reframes that you can use before a big board meeting or before a local 5K race against some high school kid like me. We talk about hunger and ambition. She calls this haunting agitation, which really cut me deep. I was like, whoa, that definitely resonates. And we talk about empirical guardrails or metrics that you can use to keep yourself in check there and channel it. We talk about these two categories of people called the motivated and the all-in, and how going all in on something can help you unlock something that's exponentially greater, and how the universe can conspire in your favor, and exercises to think if you want to go all in on something, how bad is the downside? Will I really go back to living in my parents' basement? We talk about boring as a moat, and how the people who you may not see at your local cocktail party who may seem boring might have this, very powerful engine under the hood, and the public gets this wrong about being boring, and also the build in public movement. What the hell is up with that? Finally, we touch on the concept of saying no, something that I need to get better at. Something that happens when a person gets really good at one thing is they start getting offers to do all sorts of other cool things. And that ends up actually taking away from the thing that made them really successful in the first place. Go figure. So we talk about the art of saying no to really good opportunities. This was a personally impactful podcast to me. I like when I get to step outside of the normal CFO realm. As much as I love interviewing the CFOs, Dr. Julie Gurner is an expert in a lot of things that you will benefit from if you are an ambitious, hungry person. All this and much, much more after a short word from our sponsors. As a CFO, I can say firsthand that the most important thing to know is how money enters and leaves the building. Full stop. Without a simple and easy to monitor financial system, you're flying blind. And I'm the kind of guy who likes to have all my tools in one place. I'm talking checking accounts, bill pay, credit cards, and everything else I need to run a business. I'm pumped that Mercury is both a sponsor of this podcast and a safe place to keep my cash. It sure beats keeping my cash under my mattress again. Plus, it looks slick. I always get angry when back office tools are ugly. Newsflash. Finance people may wear both a belt and suspenders to work, but we like stuff that looks good too. Sorry, I just had to get that off my chest. Mercury simplifies your financial operations with powerful banking, giving you greater control, precision, and speed so you can operate at your best. Make the switch today, like I did. Tell them your boy CJ from Run the Numbers sent you. Mercury is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services provided by Choice Financial Group and Evolve Banking Trust. Members FDIC. What does the future hold for business? Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 38,000 businesses, wow, that's a lot of companies, have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one platform. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're able to peer into the future and seize new opportunities. Download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning for free at netsuite.com/metrics. That's netsuite.com/metrics. METRICS, metrics. Please, guys, I really need this. All right, Dr. Gurner, thank you for joining the Run the Numbers podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So I emailed you recently in the lead up to recording this, and I said, you wrote this piece on positive self-talk that hit me at just the right time when I needed it. So I want to start off just by saying thank you for writing that piece.
Oh, thank you so much for being a reader. The Ultra Successful newsletter is something I'm really passionate about and trying to bring some concepts to, people at a variety of places.
And like I was saying, our audience, a lot of CFOs, a lot of COOs, a lot of venture people, a lot of people in tech and just ambitious people in general. So the Ultra Successful newsletter, I'm a paid reader. Can't recommend it highly enough.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We're growing all the time, and I'm always excited when new people and companies discover it.
So on positive self-talk, with your clients, do you have people who, I don't know, are mean to themselves? I'll put it that way, because I've found that CJ's worst critic is actually CJ. Is that a common thing amongst people who are ambitious?
I think that it's common that people carry an internal frustration, right? That there's always a bar that is higher than the one that they're currently reaching. And I think that's a really common place to be. But I do think that it always comes from a place where people are people are reaching, and not that they're particularly negative about themselves. So, you want to go forward faster. That's a very common theme with everybody that I work with. You have higher expectations than maybe the people that surround you. That's a very common theme. You have high expectations of yourself and things that you want to achieve and push forward to, and feel like you're not there faster. I think that that's, again, very common theme. But at the end of the day, I feel like most of the people I work with are pretty confident in their skill sets and what they can do. And I don't feel like they're negative around that. So I wanted to kind of make that clarification, that they may have some like, I wish I was, further faster, but it's not, running down their own skill set, not seeing themselves as capable, or any of those things.
That's such a great call out, because I'll just give a couple examples of myself, trying to be vulnerable here throughout the podcast. Okay. But you could throw me into a room and I feel like I do have the mentality of like, I'll figure it out, hell or high water. Like I'll chew a hole through the wall if I need to, just to figure this out. But actually inside my head, sometimes when I'm encountering a problem, while I'm confident in my skills, I'm calling myself names or being kind of deprecating at the same time. And I do sometimes think maybe that's a fuel that can be used, but from reading your pieces, it sounds like that can actually erode someone over time.
Yeah, it can work against you. And I think that while it may feel motivational sometimes, a better way to go about it is to kind of, dig into the things that you can do, saying that like, okay, how am I going to figure this out? Instead of, oh man, you should have figured this out, or, calling yourself some kind of a name. As soon as you start to say negative things about yourself, oftentimes the body starts to produce cortisol, stress hormone.
Okay.
And cortisol can kind of erode your ability to make the most effective decisions, be as creative as possible, be able to come into situations with kind of the most expanded place of your kind of skill set, because it's putting a stressor on you that you wouldn't normally carry.
Yeah. And you also talked about this subtle reframe of like, I got this versus like, CJ, you've got this, and where you actually use your own name. It's like the Bob Dole thing.
Yeah, it is. I call it it's sadly, if you're in my age range, you'll remember Bob Dole was made fun of because he would speak to himself in the third person all of the time, even publicly, which no one should really do. But if you're able to kind of distance yourself and kind of pull back into a third person and say, like, CJ, you've got this, Julie, you've got this, it has a different impact in the brain. And so it's actually a really fantastic way to get yourself positioned in a way that others probably don't think about or think through.
I have this question when I interview CFOs in the podcast, and we have this segment called the long ass lightning round, where it's supposed to be quick hit questions, but they inevitably go on longer than they should. And one of the questions is, if you could tell your younger self something knowing what you know today, what would you tell them? And I swear like 7 out of 10 of them always say like, don't be so hard on yourself, or tell yourself that it'll all work itself out over time. And part of me says like, yeah, that's great advice. But I'm also wondering, like, did they only get to that point because they were so driven and hard on themselves? So I don't know. I sometimes I can't square those two things.
I think that the drive is, well, let's piece that apart, because I think that the drive is something that's essential to get wherever you want to go. And that drive and ambition is something that does definitely push. But how you manifest that and how you speak to yourself around it and how you push yourself, that you can manifest that in a lot of different ways. You can use that in a lot of different ways. And so, if I had my druthers or I was working with a CFO and he says, I criticize myself a lot and it's a way of getting myself amped up, I would probably try to get into that drive and get into the things that they know they can do and approach that from a different lens. Like, let's talk about, instead of talking about you kind of criticizing yourself, let's talk about the possibilities of where you can go, or where you're aiming, or, what your potential is, and really get you excited and focused on those areas, because those are things that are going to kind of allow you to take off the brakes a little bit more and, really run harder. When you start to criticize yourself, the other thing that can tend to happen is that you'll be more cautious in your approach forward. And while that may be, I don't know if that's a preset of CFOs, that maybe they have a little bit more caution around some of the things that they do. And I don't assume that that's necessarily the case, but with those little pieces of caution come hesitation. And so then people don't run as fast as they can. So I would rather them dig into, their confidence, their ability, their excitement, because if you think about it, excitement and fear trip a lot of the same things in the body. Your heart rate goes faster, you start to sweat, your pupils dilate, all those things happen. But like on the excitement side, you're running toward the fire. On the fear side, you're a little bit more hesitant and cautious.
That's so true. I study a lot of like long distance runners and sprinters. And so I was obsessed with the Olympics recently, and I've dug into how people mentally prepare themselves before a race, and that there are subtle reframes of like fear versus excitement. And one can make it so you almost restrict yourself and put like a ceiling on what your performance would be, because like you said, you're too cautious about it. But the other one can unleash something that you didn't know you had before.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the sprinters at the Olympics who was interviewed, I cannot remember which one. It was a short distance. It might have been one of the hurdlers. I think it was the 100 meters hurdlers, had stated that, the night before she was thinking about it and she could see her name on the leaderboard as first, and that she was so excited she could kind of barely sleep. And I was thinking to myself during that interview, wow, like that woman had it. She knew exactly how to prepare. She was thinking about this moment she had been preparing for so long. And instead of saying, wow, that moment's coming tomorrow, it's only, 12 hours away, and putting all this pressure on herself, she was so excited she could barely sleep, and seeing that name on the leaderboard and visualizing how this race would happen. And visualization is really one of those keys that you'll see almost every athlete on the field is going to use.
I found myself before, like the night before a board meeting, when I know that there could be some tough conversations or questions or something like that, a subtle reframe that I've tried to do. It's not, oh, I have to go to this board meeting tomorrow. It's I get to go to this board meeting tomorrow. Like, 5 years ago, no one would have invited you to this, or you get a chance to talk about the business in a compelling way that people will appreciate.
It's a great reframe that you use. Another thing that you could do if you wanted to add to it is actually picture yourself at the board meeting, executing perfectly, answering questions off the cuff well, knowing your numbers, knowing exactly, when they throw challenges at you, taking a moment, being able to kind of put things together and throw it back. And that those kind of mental rehearsals can help people execute better in the moment. We know that with basketball, we know it for presentations. It's equally true for, board presentations or meetings.
Well, one of my other favorite pieces that you've written is on ambition. You actually called it hunger, which I think was even more fitting. And you talked about how some people have a quote, haunting agitation. And that one really hit me. I was like, whoa, okay, she gets it. Can you explain what you meant by that? Because it resonated.
I'll throw it back at you briefly. Yeah. Like, tell me what resonated about that experience, that description.
The inability to turn off hunger or ambition or wanting something or driving towards a goal, and feeling like this energy in the background that like I said, you can't turn it off. It's just always there. But sometimes it's like you want it to go away.
When we talk about like a haunting agitation, I think that the thing that I think about is that agitation, there's something that sits within you that is yet unfulfilled. And, you keep pushing and you keep striving toward it, and it sits there and it kind of gnaws at you a little bit. And it's always kind of present. So I think that your description is spot on with what I've heard from other people, but it definitely is something that kind of is sitting there. It's gnawing at you. The potential is there. And that's why I call it haunting, because I do think it follows people around and it's something that lasts. So you see people, I speak to a guy in his 70s now, he's a chairman, and, he's still got that, want to be more, that want to continue forward, that love of business. He's still in it. And I think, it's so extraordinary when you see it, but you do have to wrangle it a bit so that it doesn't consume your entire life. If, it's going to consume a lot of your life, but you don't want it to kind of level things in a destructive way.
Yeah. And I tend to obsess over things. And so I was on vacation with my wife. We went to Italy for a destination wedding, and we're on the beach. And I'm talking to her about people I'm having on the podcast, and I got to do questions and stuff because I love it. I truly do. But she's like, dude, you're stuck in gear right now. You got to stop.
Yeah, it's hard to turn off. And that's why people, when they ask me about the folks that I work with, and I say, well, they talk about work-life balance and all these things. And I said, for the majority of my clients, I would say obsession is kind of a baseline component.
Yeah.
They're all obsessed. And if I could do anything, I'd give them an off switch for a few hours to just give them a break and say, hey, go do this thing for 3 hours. But they're always thinking about it, even if they're on the golf course, if they are out at the beach, if they're kind of walking around a store, they're coming up with ideas, they're connecting things to the things that they're working on. I mean, the brain's just kind of always working. But I do think it gives them a competitive advantage, because imagine the person who, clocks in at 9, is really fantastic at their job, but they clock in at 9, they work really hard, they shut off at 5, to, let's compare it to somebody who's obsessed with it, right? They are, they're always thinking about it. They're making connections. They're out in the world. They're seeing other things. I mean, so you're comparing someone who's really working 8 hours a day to someone who's working as long as their eyes are open to some extent. And that person who's obsessed, I mean, they just lap that even hard worker just over and over and over again, because you can't compete with that. You just, unless you paid them to somehow put in the same energy at the same level, which I think would be pretty impossible without that internal drive.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Annual planning season is upon us. That's right, my favorite time of year. And it's not just about setting goals for the coming year. It's about ensuring you have the right tools in place to measure and achieve those goals. As a SaaS CFO, I know having access to reliable, real-time metrics is crucial for my annual planning process. That's why I'm so excited to partner with today's sponsor, Maxio. Maxio is a billing and financial operations platform that helps subscription businesses reconcile bookings, billings, GAAP revenue, and SaaS metrics automatically. By the way, guys, bookings, billings, GAAP revenue, not the same thing. Got to get them straight. Because these numbers are the foundation of your financial models, it's important to have quick access and trust that they are correct. Don't let the complexities of SaaS finance and accounting slow you down. If you want to start 2025 with the right tools, check out Maxio by visiting maxio.com/run the numbers. That's maxio.com/run the numbers. Request a demo through our link to support the podcast, ya boy, and receive a 10% discount on your first year with Maxio. That's maxio.com/run the numbers. maxio.com/run the numbers. Please, guys, I really need this. Okay, serious question for all my accounting pros here today. Are you doing what you were hired to do? What I mean is, do you have time to actually be a business partner, or are you buried in tedious manual tasks just to get your journal entries prepared every month? I know how that feels. Leapfin's here to help with that. Leapfin is accounting automation software that automatically prepares and posts reliable journal entries. And that's just the beginning. High-growth businesses like Reddit, Canva, and SeatGeek choose Leapfin to eliminate manual tasks, accelerate month-end close, and enable accounting leaders like you to provide faster insights that will help your company grow. If you're battling messy transaction data from Stripe, Adyen, Shopify, Apple Pay, and other PSPs, and then battling again to get it all into NetSuite, go to leapfin.com to watch their short product intro video. And if you like what you see, request a 15-minute conversation to learn how accounting automation can help you and your team. Check out leapfin.com today. That's leap like jump, fin like shark. I just made that up. I hope they're okay with it. Leapfin.com. Ready to plan confidently, close faster, and report more accurately? Here's what sets Planful apart. Imagine purpose-built applications for every department, from FP&A to accounting, marketing to HR, all with built-in financial intelligence. It's easy to implement Planful in just weeks and with minimal IT involvement, so you can rapidly and seamlessly engage everyone across the business on your key financial progress. Best of all, Planful grows with you. Its unparalleled scalability ensures that no matter how fast your business expands, Planful can keep up. See why over 1,500 customers worldwide choose Planful as their flexible, user-friendly, end-to-end financial performance management platform. Oh yeah! Go to planful.com/metrics to see how you can reach peak financial performance with Planful. That's planful.com/metrics. Yeah, I think it was the founder of Kinko's. I was listening to How I Built This with guardrails, like another podcast that I love. And he was saying there's a subtle difference between being in your business versus on your business. And he said that sometimes people would say, like, I think his name was Paul, like, I'll just call him Paul. Paul, you're only in the office 15 hours a week or something. He's like, no, but like I am on the business like 120 hours a week. Like if I'm awake, I'm thinking of the business and I'm connecting dots between. And that's something that I feel like you can't replicate, like you said, with punching in and punching out.
You can't. And Mark Zuckerberg talked about exactly the same phenomena. I mean, they say, well, you're not spending as much time at Meta as you might have in the past. And he was saying, it's always with me. I'm always thinking of it. And so I think you hear that as a common phrase with people who are really great at what they do. And you see that their companies do well, they rise, and you would look for it in a trait. We see it even with athletes. Imagine the person who goes to the gym and they train for an hour versus the person who's like obsessed and looking at the numbers and watching plays and doing all of those other things. Are just going to be better.
You wrote something comparing like a weekend warrior swimmer to a swimmer who is obsessed with their craft and like wants to go to the Olympics. And you said something that was like, it was a short phrase, but it meant a lot. It was like, they just do things different. And I think that's true. It's like their approach to everything they do is all centered around this one goal.
It is. I think one of the things that I was looking at specifically there's different approaches to things that, Olympic events. And there's one that really resonated with me. I think it was Mitch Gaylord way back in the day who was training for diving. And he said that he would show up to his training and he would have the goal of executing every dive perfectly. So he wouldn't just show up and just like, hey, I'm just going to throw out a bunch of dives today and I'm going to dive for 2 hours. He would show up and say, I'm going to execute perfectly. And the moment that I start to slip or I start to get sloppy, I'm going to stop and go home. And maybe that's 15 minutes and maybe that's 2 hours. But that he was so obsessed with his craft that he didn't want to have one moment when he was sloppy in his execution because it would give him permission to be sloppy in competition. And so when he was in it, he always wanted to be in it to a standard that others didn't hold. And he ended up doing just so fantastically well, even though he took this very untraditional method. The obsession was clearly there. When
I was at PricewaterhouseCoopers, my first job out of college, and I remember we had like a company all hands, and they hired Apollo Ono, who's the speed skater, to come in and talk. And he was talking about being obsessed. And someone asked, like, can you give an example of like being obsessed? And he said, I used to bring like my protein, like I'd make chicken or meat, whatever it was, and I would have it on like the side of the rink. So when I stopped the workout, I could immediately eat it because I thought my competitors would have to shower and go home and then they'd have their protein. And that was like my 15-minute leg up on them. I was looking for any edge.
It's amazing. It's amazing what people do. And, there isn't a way to compete with those folks. If you ever watch the Netflix series Quarterback, they follow a number of football or NFL quarterbacks, and you start to see very clearly why the dominant quarterback is dominant. It's just exceptionally clear why that person has risen to the top. They're studying plays, they're looking at their competitors, they're training differently, they're in it differently. It's a really great look behind the scenes if your audience really wants to look at like comparing people at high levels, but what does exceptional look like? And you can see what exceptional looks like compared to like somebody who's just simply great.
Somewhat related to this, you'd mentioned that relationships have an impact or are linked in many ways to ambition. I think it was Paul Graham had written that, like, when you marry your spouse or your partner, you should make it clear to them that, like, you have this haunting agitation or whatever we may call it here, because it's almost like a disease, like it's not going to go away. And maybe that's almost a morbid way of thinking about it, but can you maybe just speak to the impact on relationships and being clear about that if you're an ambitious person?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the people that I see who've done very well in their relationships over the long term have partners who understand who they are and are on board with it. Marriages are a team sport. You have to be kind of on the same page, or they're either going to make your life better and kind of propel you forward and support you, or they're going to make it a whole lot harder to succeed. And they're going to drain your emotional energy. It's going to pull from you, and it's actually going to negatively impact you. And down the line, maybe your finances, depending on what your situation is. So, you want someone who's on the same team, but it's a kindness to them as well. You want someone to know what they're getting into, right? Like, you're an ambitious person. You have great goals. You're going to focus on them. You're very focused on them. These are some of the things I'm really excited about in the future. These are things I want to pursue, and that you're going to spend significant time pursuing them. If somebody expects you to just, again, be someone who clocks in and clocks out, then that's probably not a reasonable expectation. And you're always going to have that friction point.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that, especially early on when you're dating, a lot of times it sets a precedent that isn't going to continue in the marriage. You when you're dating, you make time for people, you spend these leisurely afternoons, and you have these meals together, and you engage with each other in a very different way. And sometimes after you've been married a bit and you're focused on your career and everyone's kind of in their particular zone, that kind of leisurely together time has to be planned, and you have to make it a priority, but at the same time they have to understand, like, where your head's at, where your goals are, and hopefully they're really excited about it and they're cheering you on.
That's a great point. Like, dating is not the scenario that's always going to be the norm. It's like the on-ramp to the relationship, but you have to understand, like, what field you'll be playing on from there on out.
It's a good point. Really great point. And your partner doesn't have to be equally ambitious. They just have to be someone who is fine with who you are, just as you have to be fine with who they are, right? I mean, if they want to be, maybe a stay-at-home parent, or they want to be somebody who is, involved in their own business, whatever that is, you have to be on board too. So I think that there's a kind of a give and take.
Did you ever watch Breaking Bad?
I watched the first few episodes of it, and then I kind of fell off.
But the premise. So a man finds out he's dying of cancer. He ends up quitting his job as a teacher, and he becomes basically like a meth drug dealer. He becomes a drug lord, a kingpin. And throughout the series, he tells his wife, Skylar, like, I'm doing this for you. I'm going through all these, like, trials and tribulations and jumping through hoops and not spending time with you and doing all these illegal things for the kids and for you. And all along, she's like, I think you're actually doing it for yourself, because this is the first thing you've ever truly been successful at. And he still keeps beating the drum. I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this for you. And then the last episode of it, sorry, spoiler alert for people, when he's on the lam and he's about to get caught or he's about to die, he fesses up and he's like, I did it for me. I did it because I was good at it and I enjoyed it. And that always made me think, like, what's the line between ambition of doing it, like, for you and your family for the greater good, and then versus just doing it because, like, it's almost like this drug that you can get high off of.
I do think that the goalposts move, right? I mean, you say, and you probably have noticed this yourself, that, early on when you were younger, maybe you were 16, you're like, oh, if I earned six figures, that would be amazing. Like, I would be so rich. And then eventually you get there and you're like, well, that isn't really as wealthy as I'd like to be. Like, that doesn't really get me as far as I thought. And then, kind of the goalposts move a little bit more, or, you want to have a certain equity stake in something, or you want to be involved in a certain caliber of company, or you want to start your own thing. So, like, you have to assume that the goalposts move. And so I think a lot of times people can get a lot of satisfaction out of, tracking things. They can get a lot of satisfaction on, like, setting these goals and then watching themselves hit it, but assume that the goalposts are going to move. And is enough ever going to be enough? For some people, the answer is going to be no. And for other people, they will actually have a line in the sand. I've had people who say, look, I want to, once I reach X point, I'm going to scale back and I'm going to do this other venture that I'm really interested in, or I've had people like sell a company and then start other things because their ultimate goal was to do something very large scale for, maybe pharmaceuticals or something in health or something, kind of a moonshot. So I think everyone has this different goal, but you have to kind of know where you're going, but you don't always know the path to getting there. And it can give you a little bit more direction.
If I was to play it back, it sounds like setting up some sort of empirical guardrails can help manage it.
I think it can. And, as long as you don't get obsessed with the variance of how those metrics will look, right? Like some people will say, oh, well, I'm going to track my portfolio. And then they're looking at it like every day, which you probably shouldn't. And, you can get taken off track with those things. But yeah, setting up metrics is a great way for ambitious people to begin to kind of mark themselves on this path forward. You say, I want to have X amount in, a trust, or I want to have X amount invested, or I want to be able to write certain checks into other companies, or, or I want to have a certain real estate portfolio, or whatever that is. And you can watch yourself kind of hitting these marks on the way. It's like if you're running a race, you're just seeing those posts every so often and hey, I'm tracking. This feels great. And it gives you like that little shot in the arm as you're moving forward. I think it's really important.
And I've often tried to set those goalposts for myself too. I remember I was still in college. I was working at a gym, and there was this guy Sean who would work out there too, and he was 2 years older than me. And so like I'm towards the end of my college career. He's a couple of years into the workforce. I remember he came in one day and he's like, CJ, I just took a new job after like a year and a half at this place. They upped my salary to $85,000, and I thought like I can't even fathom what he's going to do with that at that age, like that,
right?
Like if will I get to that stage? But like the goalposts just move so much. And so I also wonder if it's more about the hitting the metric or hitting the goal, or if it's this feeling of forward momentum that people want more. One of my favorite lines from the show Billions is Taylor Mason is talking to Wendy, and they say like, I value the feeling of forward momentum over everything else. It's less about the numbers. And that definitely resonated with me.
Yeah, I definitely think that people, when they feel stuck, feel their worst, right? Like if you feel like either you're being suppressed, I think that's when people too who are ambitious want to leave companies, as they feel that they're being held down in some way, or they're not really able to kind of move. And I definitely think that feeling momentum, even if it's not connected to numbers, makes a big difference. Like, for example, if your comp is the same, but you're noticing that like your capabilities are growing, or, like that stuff still matters. That stuff still makes you feel, alive and moving ahead, because that eventually all of this stuff is going to amalgamate and it's going to become something greater. It's just a matter of time. So I think that there's a lot of impatience on the short term and patience in the long term. And you have to be able to put those two things together.
That totally makes sense. I want to talk about going all in a second, but before we move there, just one more thing touching on ambition and hunger. So I love that you referenced Alan Greenberg, a memo from Bear Stearns way back in the day. I always get such a kick when people dig up like old emails or memos and circulate them. Like you can find like old Steve Jobs ones and things like that. But he said he was looking for PSDs. Can you explain what he meant in that memo?
Yes. So at the time, much like today, you had people who were really starting to value, people who were getting these advanced business degrees, and they were MBAs and others. And he said, no, we want PSDs. We want people who are poor, smart, and have a deep desire to become rich, because those people have a drive that you just will not beat. And he kind of proved that out over and over and over again by the people that they hired. Eventually, Jeffrey Epstein would be one of those people that, someone would hire who, poor, smart, and a deep desire to become rich. And he was a math teacher and, kind of eventually, I believe, kind of fit that criteria. But there are, like he was finding over and over again that what you value is what you end up getting. And so if you value kind of the technical competence, you're going to get the technical competence. But do you want the technical competence, or do you want to have, maybe a fraction of that technical competence, but have the drive that really will push the company forward? And they found with a number of hungry people, the company momentum just pushed, and they pushed each other. It was a really fantastic and kind of notable memo, because I think a lot of times you hear that mirrored in tech as well, that like We want people who are hungry and driven. And, if you're an engineer and maybe, you didn't go to Stanford, but, you've been creating apps since you're 16 years old and you really want to be a part of something from the ground up, you're going to find a spot in a number of different locations.
I feel like that mentality is really coming back in tech lately, at least from my vantage point of like privately held startups looking for hidden talent. It's less about finding someone, even with some of the brand names. Like you used to be able to say, I worked at YouTube or Google or Facebook and you get any job in the world. Now I actually feel like it's being pushed back a bit. They're like, oh, well, you probably don't know how to operate like an ambiguity.
Yeah, I think in what I see is that people who are at Google have a reputation for being great at maintaining a certain caliber of operation. But when you're looking for somebody who's 0 to 1, who's going to start something from nothing, you want people who are really gritty and who can kind of will things into existence and are willing to do the work to kind of get them there. So a lot of early stage companies really don't look for the people who've been at Google because they tend to have a harder time transitioning to a 0 to 1 operation. If you're used to making a certain comp and you're used to having a certain life and used to cutting off at a certain time, and certainly that's probably different at different departments at Google, but 0 to 1 is its own special animal. And so you need people who are willing to wear 10 hats, really grind hard and work a lot. And that's a special kind of person.
That's awesome. I want to talk about going all in, which is something that you've written about quite a bit. You categorized people into these two buckets, and it was the motivated and the all in. Can you explain the difference between those two categories?
Absolutely. I think that the motivated people get to good places in life, right? I mean, they can get to good positions and they can have good jobs. But I think that the exceptional positions and the exceptional jobs and the exceptional companies come from people who have these, go all in on them. And what I mean by all in is that they are not the people who are motivated and, apply for their things and they kind of show up and do things well. Everything they have is kind of centered on this goal. And usually they operate in very intensive and immersive kind of sprints of operation. Like in their life, they will probably look back and say, man, for those 2 years, I ate, I slept, I thought about, this company all the time. I was 100% in it. I put my resources in it. My thoughts were in it. I talked about it. You are really all in. And it's not that you're ever not all in. Usually when you've started ventures like that, it's that, the way in which you can work that intensely happens in sprints over time so that, that kind of immersion, you'll see people be in it for a couple of years and then they kind of surface for a while and then they do different types of scaling operations. They can hire some folks and then they have other moments where they have to be immersed in the same way, but they personally are all in. And we see that even with larger companies. You'll see it with Mark Zuckerberg, throughout Facebook/Meta's history, he hasn't always been doing all the jobs, but he's been intensely invested in making this thing happen and making it work well. And we see that across a number of different founders who are very visible as well. So the other thing that's different is that when you're all in, I don't think that it means that you have to drop everything else in your life, but I do think that a lot of your life will not look like other people's. So, when you're motivated, your life, you look around and you say, well, my friends are going on this vacation and, they're deciding to buy a house and they're doing these things and you're probably on par or like on pace and you kind of fit in there. But when you look at people who are all in, they're the person who sometimes they skip the events. Sometimes they're not investing the same way other people are. Their lives look a little bit different. They live a little bit differently because like resources are allocated in a different way. The way in which their time is allocated is a different way. And how they spend their time is usually in a very different way. So oftentimes these people feel kind of alone or that they are on their own in these ventures. And it's just because, you're not going to be an exceptional person being like everyone else. And I think that sometimes feels very lonely in the moment and very hard, honestly.
I love how you brought up, like, if you compare yourself to other people in your scenario, your neighbors or something, like your life may not look like them. Like you're not, taking off school vacation to go somewhere. your weekends may not look the same. It reminds me that, and I don't know why it's going around the internet right now, but there's this video of a younger Jerry Seinfeld, and he's talking to this comedian backstage, and the comedian is still trying to make it, and he's saying basically like, hey, Jerry, like I've been at this for like 8 years or something. Feel like I'm beating my head up against a wall trying to break into this. I'm almost 30 now. My friends are all getting married. They're having kids. They're all making like really good money in life. And I'm doing these shows for like $100 a night or something like that. And Jerry like looks at him like, he's like, do you have something better to be doing right now? And it's so pure the way he says it, because it's like, if he just like doesn't get it, like this is the only thing to him. Like he'd rather be like walking shoeless in the snow than being like those other people out there.
Right. I mean, and we see that. It's such a great example. And we see that with Gary Vaynerchuk also, you know, like he's in his 30s. And think about what most guys are doing in their 30s, and he's posting YouTube videos about pairing wine with jelly beans or something, you know, and nobody's watching them. And he's like obsessed with doing this. And like it took a long time for somebody to actually pay attention. And now that guy is, you know, really a rock star, doing a lot of different things and running his own media company and doing quite well. But yeah, his life certainly didn't look like others in his space. So I think that difference, sometimes people feel internally really, you know, kind of odd or weird, or maybe there's something wrong with me. But at the end of the day, it's just that you have to have an internal reference point rather than one that is external. Because if you're looking for others to determine your path, it's going to really suppress your potential, because you're kind of measuring by the average instead of measuring by your own internal potential, which is where most great people reference, you know, that point internally versus externally.
Oh, that's so amazing. Like you're measuring against the median or the norm. You're not measuring against your own ability to achieve excellence. That like just clicked for me live.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. And so that's why when people, you know, they feel badly about themselves around that, you know, I think to myself, you know, if others who we see as great would have done that, they wouldn't be who we know them to be today. Like if Musk were to say, hey, you know, I'm going to compare myself to other guys in their 30s or 40s,
yeah,
you know, he wouldn't have the life that he does today.
There are a lot of people in this motivated bucket who say or feel that they want to go all in, but there seem to be some hangups. Can you name some of those common hangups?
Sure. I think the hangups are, you know, again, being externally referencing things. So the judgments of other people, what other people will say. I think it's risk tolerance. People who don't want to kind of put all their eggs in a couple of baskets, and they want to just have their work basket and then have some other things happening, but don't want to. I think they're people who sometimes fear being judged and being embarrassed by what other people think. So there's a lot of like, maybe it's self-doubt, not thinking that, you know, if you do go all in and you fail, well, then you're going to fail probably in front of others. And then there's all these other things that you have to contend with. So I do think it's an internal challenge and not necessarily an external one. I think a lot of motivated people could, and probably if your audience is thinking right now to themselves, you know, how many of you know you have the potential to be greater than what you are right now, and yet you're not doing anything about it, right? Like, what are you doing about that? You're just going to carry that around and put it on a shelf and pass by it every now and again. But what are you doing about it? And why aren't you doing anything? And so, I mean, the challenge is internal, really, not external. There are plenty of opportunities and things you could probably think to do, but unless you actually take action to make that a reality, think to yourself, what are all the reasons I'm not like taking action to do this next thing? And because there is somebody out there who knows that they could be greater, who is taking that step. And that's really the difference. All of the things that hold you back from making that next move or trying that thing, even if it's in small iterations, that's the thing that is keeping the motivated separate from, you know, those who end up going all in. It's small steps.
I think one of the biggest hangups is the sunk cost fallacy of saying, well, I've put 10 years, 20 years of my life into, I'll just make it up, climbing this ladder to become a CFO. And if I try to go and achieve this excellence that I feel like I can have, I'm almost throwing all that away.
The thing we know statistically is that people are most likely to start successful companies in their 40s, which, when we think about it that way, with regard to sunk cost fallacy, is that these are people who are probably, these are your high earning years in your mid 40s. They are times when you're pretty well along in your career. So it's funny that those very people who would possibly, kind of relent to the sunk cost fallacy, and in this time in their life, they have families and homes and all those things, are also the people most likely to start a successful company or start a successful venture at that point in their life. And to me, I feel like we can go the direction of sunk cost, where I've invested so much, or you can see that as I've gained so much information from being an expert in my career for so long that I've seen all of these angles, and I finally feel like I'm at a point where I can put them all together and do something exceptional. And it's worth kind of taking that risk. So the sunk cost fallacy is an interesting one, because I do think you're spot on, and that it keeps people maintained in a certain place of comfort. But I also think that because we know statistically that the very people who are the most likely to start successful companies are in that sweet spot of great income, great place in your career, that clearly there are some people who are viewing those skills a little bit differently.
I loved how you flipped it on its head. It's not that I'm losing all this stuff I built up. It's that I finally built up enough data points to connect the dots.
That's the hope, right? I mean, that's what we want, is that, you've had all of this experience. And it's why people who are younger, even though we do glorify and give a lot of press to younger founders who do quite well, they're statistical outliers. And it's why they don't have as many data points to pull in.
Do you ever go through like a thought exercise with people who are thinking about going all in, just to go through it and say, like, is the downside scenario here as bad as you think? Are you really living like in your parents' basement again?
Yeah. I mean, one of the questions that I tend to ask people is, what's the worst case scenario? And if you can live with the worst, the chances are, when we think about these things, I always want to look at the worst case scenario, and I want to look at the best case scenario, because both of those probably, they're not as likely to happen. But there is a something in between that's either skewing upward or skewing downward that may. And so if they can handle the worst case scenario, like let's talk about, what if all of this goes to absolute garbage, right? Like you try something, it all flames out, it's a terrible failure. Let's walk through what that looks like. What would you do? And usually people will say, well, because I'm a planner, I'm going to have, a year's worth of income in the bank, so that, if things aren't working out, I still have a backup. It's not a plan B, but it's, protecting their downside, which I think are very different. So they're going to have some money in the bank. And then, if they look at the worst case scenario and they're like, well, if it did fall apart, I just go and get a job for X, because my skills are still at a certain level and I have a certain amount of experience. And now I have founding a company under my belt or raising capital, that, I guess that's what I do. I just start in with a different company and perhaps take a little bit of a haircut on pay from what I was at previously. And then if they say, well, that isn't that bad, then it kind of sets the stage for them to say, okay, well, what does it take? And then we start having the conversation. What does it take for you to feel like, I don't want to say comfortable, I was going to say that, but like, what does it take for you to protect the downside that we can protect, and to take the chance to really like flesh this thing out? And what does that look like? Because it doesn't have to be, I quit my job and then I start working. For a lot of people, it's I stay with my job and I start developing this thing on the side. And then they spin it up and they spin it up. And then we start talking about, well, okay, tell me about revenue markers. What makes sense? And then we start talking about eventually the transition point to leaving the job to that thing full time. But it doesn't always have to be run wildly into the weeds, like naked and screaming.
Yeah.
You want to plan things a bit and be smart about how you take these things on.
I did pick up on a subtle difference of something that you said. You said protecting downside versus having a plan B. having a plan B is different, right?
I agree. Yeah. I think that having a plan B is what I call a cognitive out. It's a way that you're like holding something in your mind that it doesn't allow you to go all in because you're holding this thing in your head that you go, well, like when this other thing gets hard, you start to say, well, I can go work for Joe. He has an open offer. So, this is really not feeling right. And, we have a mortgage to pay. And, so you start negotiating with yourself around this plan B, and then it starts to look pretty attractive. But if you just have a certain amount of money in the bank and you've protected your downside as much as you possibly can, but things start to get really hairy and the things that you've pushed forward, you're much more likely to fully engage because you're in it now. This is all there is. So you're going to push, you're going to use your resources in that direction, and you're not going to allow yourself to escape it by doing the thing that's kind of right next door to you in your plan B.
Well, speaking about being all in and not having that, ulterior thing to the side, you'd said that the motivated group may be 70% all in, but it does seem like when you do go all in, you give that extra 30%, the world almost like conspires in your favor. It's like a non-linear return. Like even though it's 30% more that you get way more than 30%.
You do. And I think the other kind of kicker to that is that I think the world really rewards people who are true believers. I remember watching an interview. It was early on, and I think it was Bezos was talking with David Rubenstein, and he was saying how he wanted to go to space. And it was very, very early in Amazon's, kind of development. And people were laughing in the audience. You could hear them laughing, right? And as he begins to move forward at Amazon, he's still saying the same thing. And then eventually he's like, now when he's already, done Blue Origin, he's come back from that first flight, he's starting to say, oh, I want to develop an infrastructure on the moon, and I want to do all of these things. Or maybe it's on Mars, I forget which, but he was talking about developing infrastructure and really starting to create a society. And, people take it absolutely seriously. They see the conviction, they see he's all in, they understand who he is. No one's kind of laughing at that. So I think that when you are like fully committed and you are all in, we saw that with the Olympics. I mean, those athletes, they are all in. Nobody can, and it's so beautiful and intoxicating to watch because that for those less than 5 minutes, they've been training for years and years of their life to run that sprint or to do that particular event. And you get to watch people be all in. And I think that's part of the beauty of sports and the Olympics and all of those types of moments. We want to be a part of that energy.
Have you read The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho?
I haven't, but I've heard great things about it.
That's where I got the phrase the world conspires in your favor, like when you choose to follow kind of like your destiny, they call it, or I think it's basically like follow the story that you have within you. It is a bit folksy and stuff, but to your point, there's something like totally intoxicating about somebody who's like, I'm just going for it.
Absolutely. And if you have listeners who are VCs, I'm sure that one of the variables they look for is conviction. You want a founder who has full conviction in their idea. And sometimes, with founders, you look for people who have full conviction. And at times, the venture capitalist or the investor will say, even if you don't end up doing that particular idea, I know that this founder will figure it out. They are that passionate. They are that motivated. They're that engaged that we understand that this person is going to make something happen.
That's awesome. And one of the traits or characteristics of someone who's going all in, it's kind of counterintuitive. They actually may be pretty boring people because they've chosen like this singular path. What traits though are usually under the hood of someone who may appear to be boring from a distance?
I think there's a lot of tenacity in people who are willing to do the boring things. Because if you think about it, my sister is a high school teacher, and when she asked her class, what do you want to be when you grow up? And again, this is 11th and 12th grade. The majority of them said influencers. That's what they want to be. Yeah, it's shocking, right? But people want to be something that seems sexy and interesting. It's sometimes why people go into startups versus going into legacy organizations that honestly would have great comp or great career trajectories. So I think that by doing the boring thing and being willing to do it, you're kind of zigging when everyone else is zagging to some extent. You're doing the opposite of what the majority are attracted to and going into. And for me, I always say that like the door that everybody's trying, like the thing that everyone's going to is a very crowded path and it's a crowded door. But boring is just, it opens the field. You can be incredibly tenacious, I think some of the traits, they're tenacious, they're dedicated, they're willing, they have a lot of, sometimes discipline. They can be incredibly obsessed. They're people who have a mission and they're kind of locked into that. And they have an ability to do things that are counter to what everyone else is doing. And to me, that's always a really positive signal. The person who's willing to, grind for, hours and hours on end because it is boring and sometimes involves things that other people don't like and don't want to do. Those are things that not everybody can do. And I think that we hear people, you mentioned at some point in the past around hustle culture and how people can kind of demonize that. And it's because they're distancing themselves from that, right? Like hustle culture sounds like a lot of work. And people don't like, a good way of saying, oh, I don't want anything to do with that is that I don't see myself being able to connect or engage just like that. Whereas you see people who are really hungry, like they connect with that. They're like, hey, you slept on the floor to get that product out. That's amazing. Like, good for you. Or, you were able to, kind of grind in your basement with like eating cheese sandwiches for a year because you were so into this one thing happening. Like, that's incredible. Now you don't want to stay there forever, but obviously like to be able to do that goes against everyone else who's going to brunch or having nice, things and, going out with their friends. So it's really about zigging when others are zagging and doing the thing that other people kind of don't have the fortitude for. And so for me, when I think about the person who's boring, I think about boring as such a strategic advantage overall. And those folks are as ambitious, as hungry, as, like I said, tenacious as they come. I see them like a cheetah, right? Like cheetahs are known to be kind of shy and they don't really attack people. But, when you let that cheetah run toward a goal and it has a goal, it is the fastest land animal on earth. And it is absolutely ferocious. And I think about that like the boring person, right? You just got to like give it a way to run. It is all in. And from the outside, people may see it as kind of, laid back, but under the hood, there's a lot more there.
I think boring is a moat in a lot of ways. Completely.
We agree.
I think that the build in public movement gets a lot wrong about being boring because it almost forces you to show this external progress, whereas building something that's durable, that'll last the test of time, you may not have that feedback loop to be able to readily show people every day.
I agree with you. I think building in public is a lot of distraction, and it also pulls your validation toward an external post, right? So if you're building in public, and then let's just say that you're really onto something, and you might hear two people from, the atmosphere say, oh, that really sucks, or that's too complicated, or, no one's going to use that. It may encourage you to give up an idea that maybe you were just ahead of your time on, or that somebody else just couldn't see yet. So and it also just causes you to have that internal conversation at all. So I'm fine with people being in public. I have a very public presence on like Twitter.
Yeah.
But what I talk about there isn't something that I'm testing the waters on. I'm not showing how I'm building. You can make connections just like with tech. I think it can be really beneficial for founders or for others to make connections with VCs on Twitter or, have those relationships. But as far as building anything and kind of putting it out there to the public, it's probably more detrimental than it is helpful.
And so we've talked about ambition. We've talked about going all in. We've talked about singular focus and boring as a moat. I think it kind of culminates in this last piece that I want to touch on. And it's kind of the art of saying no, because something that I've observed is when a person gets really good at one thing, they start to get offers to do like all sorts of other stuff. And that actually ends up taking away from the thing that made them successful in the first place. Can you speak to the art of saying no to actually like really good opportunities?
Yeah, you phrased it perfectly. You know, on your way up, you pray for opportunities. You just hope somebody's going to give you a shot. And then as you get really good at what you do, now everyone's throwing these opportunities. You have to, I think it's again, you have to decide like what are the outcomes I want? What are the goals I have? And does this opportunity align with that? Is it going to help me get there? And you have to have a filter. So I always think about with people that I work with, like, what are your filters? Is this for some people, they'll say, look, I have this particular professional career, but if it helps my family in this way, or if it helps my fitness in some way, then maybe it'll get through the filter. But know exactly, kind of what you're aiming for. And then you can filter everything else through it, because it can be a phenomenal opportunity. But if it's not a phenomenal opportunity for you, or it's going to pull you away from your goals, then it's totally fine for you to say, I appreciate you reaching out. You keep the connection. My bandwidth is X. And I cannot take this project on, but I wish you all the best. Sounds really interesting. Maybe you connect them with a friend of yours who would be a great fit for it, and you still remain in a great positive place. You don't have to sidetrack yourself. You've made a great connection, and you kind of move forward. And you can tap that connection if you ever need it in the future.
I've observed, and this is probably a personal observation at its core, if I've noticed it, is that two reasons why people don't say no when they should is one, they have an ego about it, or two, they're a people pleaser and don't want to let people down.
Yeah. I mean, I think that when we get down to people pleasing, the ego component, that is a whole different animal. But when you think about people pleasing, there's usually a lot of thoughts under that. And, like the people pleasing is the evidence, we see the symptom, but the actual problem is beneath that, which is how you think about your relationship with other people.
Right.
And like, do you feel like other people will be disappointed and then you can't tolerate that, or that they'll be mad and you can't tolerate that, or, that somehow that brief moment will somehow translate into something that you can't manage. So I always look at, well, what's laying really beneath that challenge of pleasing others, and what's the cost of it to you down the road? Is it as far as your time, your ability to push your own things forward, your emotional energy, your energy generally? And is that cost really something that's worth taking on? Sometimes with people pleasers, something that ends up happening is they become so busy and their time becomes so kind of booked that then they get even increasingly frustrated because they can't do the things they really want to do that are really important to them. And they end up resenting all the commitments that they've made, instead of really doing the things sporadically that that would be giving for you. For example, you've taken on so many projects that now, like, helping your mom is something that becomes really hard because you don't have the time to do this thing on your mom's property or something, when really you'd probably value being able to do that more, having time for your own projects, and allocating your time a bit differently.
Oh, resenting something is like the ultimate way to describe it, because I've had that visceral feeling where I commit to something because I think I should do it to help somebody, or like I feel like I don't want to let them down. And then I see it on my calendar and I'm like, oh, I just really don't want to go. Oh, and you can just feel it in your soul.
It's true. It's true. And, like, once you start the process of being a little bit more ruthless about that, it becomes much easier over time. So I'd encourage you, if you have that feeling in your gut that, I'd really like not to take this on, I would really follow that and start, even if it makes you feel bad in the moment, recognize that the moment it's out of your mouth and you've said no, that, you'll be on the other side of it and it's not quite as bad as you think. Just say it kindly and gracefully.
My resolution for 2025 is going to be to say no more gracefully and say it more often and not feel bad about it. I think that's the biggest thing, like, because there is something freeing if you just lean into it and say it in a polite way and just, okay, done.
Well, we have some months left of 2024, so you could start.
Oh man, you're going to hold me to it.
All right, know.
Fine.
Why
Dr.
wait?
Gurner, I could go on for hours with you. I love your content. I have a list of a whole other set of questions that I could ask you. So maybe you could come on in the future again. I just want to say thank you for all the work you do. And where can people find you if they want more?
If people want to find me, I'm always on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Gurner, Drgurner, and they can find me on the Ultra Successful newsletter on Substack. It's been a pleasure talking with you, CJ. Great connecting.
Run the Numbers is a mostly LLC production. Yelling an intro by Fat Joe. Artwork by some AI thingamajig. Podcast and video editing is done by Cleancast at cleancast.io. Nothing said on this podcast is intended to be business or investment advice. It's the sole opinion of me, a guy who feeds his dog too much ice cream and has a history of net operating losses, LOL. If you like this podcast, please hit subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. And also check out mostlymetrics.com. That's my newsletter where I explore business models and financial metrics. Thanks for riding with me. Share this with your friends. Peace.